2 centuries ago, Napoleon Bonaparte gave this really potent warning. He said, "Let China sleep. When she wakes, she will shake the world."
And here we are, China's awake, and you can definitely feel the world starting to shake, can't you?
Absolutely. And that shaking, that potential clash, that's exactly what we're diving into today, isn't it? We're looking at Graham Allison's big book, Destined for War.
Right, and specifically his core idea, the Thucydides Trap.
Okay, so we've got Napoleon's warning kind of echoing in the background. How do we start to unpack this awakened China? What's our main goal with this deep dive into Allison's work?
Well, the mission really is to pull out the absolute key insights from Allison. We need to get our heads around just how huge China's transformation has been.
Okay.
Then look at some of these, well, frankly, spooky historical parallels he draws. And maybe most importantly, think about the really tough actions both the U.S. and China might need to take to keep the peace long term.
So it's not just about, like, the immediate triggers for a conflict.
No, exactly. It's much deeper. It's about understanding the underlying structural stuff, the kind of tectonic plates shifting that can set the stage for war down the line.
And you really need that context, don't you? I mean, for 70 years after World War II, we had this rules-based system, mostly led by Washington. A relatively peaceful period, the long peace.
A rare period, yeah. But now, Allison argues, this incredibly powerful China is, let's say, challenging that order, maybe even unraveling parts of it. And that raises these massive questions about global peace going forward.
Right.
And a critical point he makes right away is this denial problem. He feels many Americans just haven't fully grasped what China's rise actually means for the U.S.
Maybe because it happened so fast, it's easy to sort of miss the scale.
Possibly, but the numbers, I mean, when you look at the data Allison presents, it's just mind-blowing. The economic velocity is incredible.
Okay, give us some highlights then. What are we talking about numbers-wise?
Okay, so think about 1980 versus, say, 2015. China's GDP. It went from just 7% of the U.S.'s GDP to 61%. Yeah, that's jumping from under $300 billion to $11 trillion.
Right.
That made it the world's second biggest economy just using market exchange rates.
Okay, that's massive just on its own. But it wasn't just GDP, was it?
Not at all. Their imports compared to the U.S., 8% up to 73%. Exports, 8% to a huge 151%.
That's 151%.
Yeah. And foreign reserves, 16% to over 3,000%, 3,140% to be exact of U.S. reserves. Their global trade basically multiplied 100 times, $40 billion to $4 trillion.
These aren't just statistics, are they? This represents a fundamental shift in global economic weight. It challenges everything we assumed.
It really does. And Allison uses these great analogies to help you grasp it. Like, since 2008, just the increase in China's GDP every couple of years, that increase alone was bigger than the entire economy of India.
That's incredible.
Or in 2015, China's economy basically created a new Greece every 16 weeks, a new Israel every 25 weeks. It's just this relentless pace. China isn't just growing, it's reshaping the whole global economic map at, well, almost unprecedented speed.
And there's this interesting point about how we measure it, right? Allison talked to Stanley Fischer, big name, former MIT, former Fed vice chair.
Right, and Fisher's take was that the best measure when you're thinking about economic and military clout is purchasing power parity, PPP.
And by that measure,
China's already overtaken the U.S. on most indicators, already number one.
So they're not just the world's factory anymore making cheap stuff. They're the dominant force in manufacturing overall.
Absolutely. Pretty much across the board, ships, steel, aluminum, furniture, clothes, phones, computers, you name it. And crucially, they're also now the world's biggest consumer for a lot of this stuff. Cars, for instance. They sold 20 million in 2015. That's 3 million more than the U.S. Biggest market for cell phones, e-commerce, most internet users, biggest oil importer, biggest energy consumer, installing the most solar power. It's production and consumption dominance.
Okay, so if they're making all this stuff, is there also a shift towards, like, genuine innovation? Are they moving up the value chain into high-tech leadership?
Allison definitely highlights that. Look at high-tech manufacturing value add. China's share globally went from 7% in 2003 to 27% by 2014. And during that same time, the U.S. share actually went down.
That's a significant swing.
It is. And look at 2015 again. China filed twice the patent applications the U.S. did. They added 2.5 times more industrial robots. They're leading now in making computers, semiconductors, comms equipment, even pharmaceuticals. It's a clear strategic move beyond just being the workshop.
That sounds less like catching up and more like, well, surging ahead in some really key areas.
It certainly looks that way, and the trend seems set to continue. In 2015, they were the first country ever to file over 1 million patent applications in 1 year, almost double the U.S.
1 million patents.
Yeah. And R&D spending. Projections were they'd surpass the U.S. by 2019. Supercomputing, something the White House itself flagged as vital for competitiveness and security. Since June 2013, the world's fastest supercomputer, it's been in China. By 2016, they had more of the top 500 fastest machines than the US 167 versus 165. And their top machine was 5 times faster than the best American one, built entirely with their own processors.
Okay, so even with the reputation for cyber theft and spying,
Which Allison acknowledges is still an issue.
you just can't ignore their rise as a genuine innovator now.
Exactly. That power is real and growing.
And inevitably, I suppose, this economic and tech power fuels military expansion.
It follows, doesn't it? 3 decades of that kind of growth. It's allowed China to expand its military capabilities about 8-fold. Their defense budget is second only to the U.S. $146 billion market exchange, but over $300 billion if you use that PPP measure. That's double Russia's budget.
And regionally, they're becoming dominant.
That's what the data suggests. There was a big RAND study in 2015, the U.S.-China military scorecard. It projected that by 2017, China would have an advantage, or at least approximate parity, in most areas of conventional fighting, like attacking air bases. That points to a real shift in the regional balance of power.
So the economic muscle, the tech surge, the military buildup, it's all happening. How does this translate into projecting power globally? Allison points to one massive project, doesn't he?
It does. The Belt and Road Initiative, often called OBER, One Belt, One Road. This is Xi Jinping announcing essentially a $1.4 trillion plan.
Trillion with T?
With a T. A $1.4 trillion investment to build this new Silk Road, highways, railways, airports, ports, pipelines stretching right across Eurasia. It aims to link something like 65 countries, home to over 4 billion people.
The scale is just staggering.
It really is. We're talking about 900 different projects. One analyst, Stephen Jen, put it in perspective.
Yeah.
He calculated it's equivalent to about 12 Marshall Plans adjusted for inflation.
12 Marshall Plans. That really paints a picture. And Allison includes this anecdote from Stephen Bosworth, the diplomat, that kind of captures the shift in influence on the ground, right?
Yeah, it's very telling. Bosworth described going back to Asia after being away for a decade as a Rip Van Winkle experience. Meaning he noticed this fundamental change. Before, in a crisis, Asian leaders would always ask, what does Washington think? Now, he said, the first question is often, what does Beijing think?
Wow. That's a huge shift in the center of gravity, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It signals China's arrival not just as a competitor, but in many places as the primary power people look to.
Okay, so that's the picture. A monumental rise. Which brings us back to the core question. Has we seen this movie before? Does history give us any clues about what happens next? This is where Allison brings in the Thucydides Trap.
Right, the trap. It comes from Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian, writing about the war between Athens and Sparta. And his famous line was essentially, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. The key here is it's not about the immediate trigger, like, say, the assassination that kicked off World War I.
It's the underlying pressure cooker situation.
Exactly. It's those deep structural shifts.
Yeah.
A rising power challenges the established one. And that dynamic itself, the challenger's ambition, the incumbent's fear, creates this intense pressure where things can easily spiral out of control. It's the fear that's often the driver.
And Allison's team actually studied historical cases, didn't they? Beyond just Athens and Sparta.
They did. They looked back 500 years and identified 16 cases where a rising power seriously challenged a ruling one.
And the results?
Well, this is the sobering part. In 12 of those 16 cases, it ended in war.
12 out of 16. That's not great odds.
Not great at all. And one of the closest historical parallels Allison points to for the U.S. and China today is Britain and Germany before World War I.
Okay, what was the dynamic there?
There's this fascinating document, the Crow Memorandum from 1907. King Edward VII basically asked, why are we so suspicious of Germany? They used to be our buddies.
Right.
And Eric Crow's analysis laid it bare. It was Britain's deep-seated fear, driven by Germany's incredibly rapid industrial and military growth. Germany's share of global manufacturing had rocketed up, overtaking Britain's. Their steel production by 1914 was double Britain's. London felt deeply insecure.
So this memo essentially documented Britain's fear. It framed Germany's rise not just as competition, but as a potential threat.
Precisely. Britain felt it was like a law of nature that they had to prevent any single power dominating Europe. So what do? They started secret military planning with France. They formed the Triple Entente with France and Russia.
Classic balancing behavior, a direct response to that perceived German threat.
Textbook case. It shows how that fear, that sense of being existentially challenged, can reshape alliances and ramp up tensions, even if neither side actually wants a war initially.
Now, what about flipping the script? When the U.S. was the rising power, we weren't always top dog. Late 19th, early 20th century. We had our moments of throwing our weight around, too.
Absolutely. Look at the Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt was pretty blunt. Until we definitely turn Spain out, we will always be menaced by trouble.
And wasn't there that famous newspaper quote?
William Randolph Hearst to his illustrator. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war.
Right.
And the U.S. won quickly, took Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. One historian called it a turning point, predicting the U.S. may dominate the world. Definitely an emerging power flexing its muscles.
And there was that Alaska border thing, too, with Canada.
Yeah, the Alaska boundary dispute. Gold was found in the Yukon around 1897. Suddenly, this poorly defined border in the Alaska Panhandle became critical because the U.S. controlled the sea access routes.
Okay.
Canada pushed for a boundary that gave them direct sea access. Roosevelt thought their claim was outrageous and was apparently ready to send troops. Again, it shows that assertiveness you often see from a power on the rise.
And this links to another of Allison's clues, doesn't it? Something about alliances being a fatal attraction.
Right. The idea is that states grab allies to balance power shifts, but sometimes they misjudge things, overestimate the benefits, underestimate the differences.
And end up locked into these rigid systems.
Exactly. Like the doomsday machine of alliances before World War I, where a relatively small incident could drag everyone into a massive conflict because of treaty obligations.
Beyond the power dynamics, though, Allison really emphasizes the deep civilizational differences between the U.S. and China. This isn't just about communism versus democracy, is it?
No, it goes way deeper than political systems. He uses the example of that British mission to China back in 1793 at Lord Macartney.
What happened there?
Well, the British saw China as, frankly, backward, but the Chinese, they saw the British delegation as mere vassals bringing tribute to the emperor, the son of heaven. They literally had no framework for equal diplomatic relations because, in their view, China was the world order.
A total clash of worldviews from the start.
A fundamental one. And Allison argues that echoes of this persist. Xi Jinping today talks about China's unique path, socialism with Chinese characteristics, seeing the current state as a successor to the imperial dynasties, driven by this deep sense of national mission.
And part of that mission seems tied to overcoming past grievances. The century of humiliation.
Absolutely crucial to understand that period where China felt carved up and exploited by foreign powers, symbolized by those infamous signs like dogs and Chinese not allowed. It's burned into their collective memory. So from Beijing's perspective, there's this genuine belief, Allison says, that the U.S. is still trying to hold them back, divide China territorially, subvert it politically, contain it strategically, and frustrate it economically. And they fundamentally believe the U.S. will never accept the legitimacy of their system because it's not a liberal democracy.
That's a deep well of mistrust. And it connects to how they approach time, doesn't it? Strategic patience versus our need for quick fixes.
Yes, that's a fascinating contrast. Chinese leaders, Allison argues, play the long game. They're strategically patient. If the long-term trends look favorable, they're okay waiting decades, even centuries, to resolve issues. Think Deng Xiaoping shelving disputes over Taiwan or the Senkaku Diaoyu Island.
Whereas Americans,
We're problem solvers, right?
yeah,
We want solutions now. Our political cycles, our media cycles, they demand quick results. That difference in strategic clocks can lead to huge miscalculations on both sides.
and it directly affects how they see the current international rules.
Totally. Chinese officials will often point out, look, these rules, the UN, the WTO, international law, they were mostly created when China was weak or absent.
Yeah.
So naturally, they feel some rules need. But renegotiation, now that they're a major player, it's a fundamental challenge to the existing order's legitimacy.
Okay, so we have all these historical echoes, these structural pressures, the civilizational clashes. It sounds pretty grim. Is war really destined? Allison says no, right. There are ways out.
He does argue it's not inevitable, but avoiding it requires serious effort. And maybe the single biggest factor changing the historical equation is in his analysis. Nuclear weapons.
The ultimate game changer.
Absolutely. Hot war between nuclear superpowers. It's just not a rational option anymore. Einstein famously said nuclear weapons changed everything except our way of thinking.
But the thinking has started to change, hasn't it, among leaders?
Over time, yes. There's what some call the crystal ball effect. Leaders can actually foresee the horrific consequences of nuclear war for their own country, their own people. That forces a kind of caution that wasn't there before.
And then there's maybe mutually assured destruction.
The grim reality. A full-scale nuclear attack guarantees annihilation for both sides. It's a terrifying thought, but it does act as a powerful constraint on escalation.
So if nuclear war is unthinkable, how do we navigate this trap? What are the strategies Allison proposes to avert disaster?
Well, first, he says, you have to begin with structural realities. Leaders need to understand these deep underlying forces shaping events. It's not just about reacting to headlines or asking, what should we do today?
So use history, but be careful.
Exactly. Applied history is useful, but avoid facile analogizing. China in 2024 isn't exactly Germany in 1914. The differences matter just as much as the similarities. You can't just copy-paste solutions.
Okay, so understand the deep currents. What else? He talks about accommodation, right?
Yes, accommodation. And this is key. He distinguishes it from appeasement. It's not about giving in out of weakness. It's about realistically adapting to a new power balance to avoid conflict.
Like Britain did with the rising U.S.
That's his prime example.
Yeah.
Britain, in the late 19th, early 20th century, decided war with the U.S. was unthinkable. So they settled disputes peacefully, like in Venezuela. They even made exceptions to their naval standards for the U.S. Navy. They accommodated America's rise rather than fighting it.
Could the U.S. do that with China? That's a tough sell politically, isn't it?
Extremely tough. But it leads to the next idea. Can the U.S. and China actually negotiate a kind of long peace? Maybe a 25-year pause, like we saw between Athens and Sparta, or like U.S.-Soviet détente in the 70s.
A period where both sides focus inward, maybe, manage the competition without letting it boil over.
That's the idea. Allow both countries breathing room for domestic priorities, while maybe agreeing to disagree or shelve some of the really contentious issues for a while.
And Allison suggests there's actually a lot on the table for negotiation, if they get creative.
He lays out a whole menu, yeah. It involves linking issues that might seem unrelated. For example, maybe the U.S. dials back public criticism on human rights, and in return, China seriously cracks down on economic espionage. Or China agrees to limit missile deployments in the South China Sea, and the U.S. agrees to limit certain kinds of surveillance flights nearby. It's about finding trade-offs, reciprocal concessions.
Like during the Cold War, arms control talks.
Very much like that. He even floats things like China limiting development of anti-satellite weapons or amphibious assault capabilities in exchange for the U.S. slowing down its rapid global strike programs, or maybe delaying missile defense deployments in places like South Korea or Japan.
Even linking Taiwan arms sales to North Korea's nuclear program.
It's all part of this potential package deal approach, finding leverage points where both sides might see a benefit in compromise, even if it's painful.
Beyond managing the direct rivalry, there's also cooperation on shared threats, Allison's four horsemen.
Right. Terrorism, climate change, where China and the U.S. are the two biggest emitters by far, pandemics like we saw with SARS and COVID, plus the threat of engineered diseases and global financial crises.
These are things neither country can tackle alone.
Exactly. They're existential threats that demand cooperation. Allison sees these as potential areas where necessity could force the U.S. and China to work together, building some trust despite the competition. Shared survival kind of requires it.
And underlying all these strategies, Allison stresses the need for better understanding and, well, actually doing strategy.
Yeah, first, know thyself, know thy enemy, as Sun Tzu said. He argues U.S. leaders need a much deeper grasp of China's real core interests, not just projecting American values or assumptions onto them.
And we need to face reality. Stop playing let's pretend.
That's his phrase. Acknowledge just how spectacular China's rise has been and understand that their worldview, what he calls a kind of supremacist worldview, is deeply tied to their historical identity, not just recent economics. Diplomacy needs to be about hard-nosed national interests, not just idealistic rhetoric.
Which brings us to the need for actual strategy. He seems worried that strategic thinking has been sidelined in Washington.
He definitely raises that concern. He mentions President Clinton comparing foreign policy to jazz improvisation, or President Obama questioning the need for a grand strategist like George Kennan today.
But just improvising isn't a strategy for dealing with something this big, is it?
Not a sustainable one, Allison argues. Crafting a good strategy doesn't guarantee you'll win, but not having a coherent long-term strategy, that's almost a guarantee of failure when facing a challenge of this magnitude.
So the task ahead for both Washington and Beijing is immense. Understanding history, facing reality, making tough choices.
It's a monumental challenge. Requires deep thinking, political courage, and maybe, as Churchill urged in his time, stretching our imagination to find ways to divert the deadly current.
Because the alternative, as that German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg said about World War I, is just looking back after disaster strikes and saying,
If we only knew. The goal has to be proactive statecraft based on understanding to avoid getting to that point in the first place.